They asked me afterward why I looked at my wrist so many times during the extraction debrief. The Kalu Medical Authority, the one called Physician Auditor Thrain, the one who had cataloged every cycle insertion going back 9 years, said he counted 11 separate instances in the surveillance footage. 11 times I glanced at the display on my left wrist in the 40 minutes I spent on the extraction table before I said a single word to anyone. I told him it was habit. He wrote that down. What I did not tell him was that I was checking to make sure it still reads 0. I have a specific relationship with the number 11 that I did not have before that morning. It is not a complicated relationship. It is the kind of relationship you develop with a thing that has tried to kill you by running out and failed. 11 minutes. That was the window Physician Auditor Thrain had calculated for a Cycle 7 insertion into the vascular terrain of Ambassador Vorethden, and he had calculated it the way he calculated everything, precisely, conservatively, and with the full weight of 9 years of failure data behind him. He was not wrong. He has never been wrong about a window calculation. In all the time, the nano-medic program has run out of this facility. He was simply not accounting for what a person does when they know the window is closing. Let me go back to the beginning. Not because the beginning is interesting. The beginning is administrative, and the Kalu love administrative detail the way some people love a warm room in winter. They settle into it and stop moving. But because the thing I need to explain happened before I went in, and it happened on a scale that makes the 11 minutes feel, in retrospect, like the easy part. Ambassador Vorethden had been failing for 6 days. I use the word failing because it is the word Physician Auditor Thrain used in his intake notes, and it is technically accurate. The ambassador's secondary circulatory network, the Kalu have two, which I will explain shortly, had developed a cascade of micro-obstructions in the deep vessels feeding his cognitive processing cluster. Not a clot in any single location a standard intervention could reach. Dozens of micro-obstructions, each one smaller than a human hair's width, each one in a vessel too narrow and too deep for any conventional Kalu surgical approach. The Kalu do not practice internal nanomedicine the way we do. They have the technology. They invented several components of it, actually, which is a fact their medical authority never lets you forget. But they do not practice it on their own kind because their immune systems are catastrophically aggressive at the nanoscale. Put a foreign object smaller than a certain threshold inside a Kalu body, and the immune response is not targeted. It is total. The body does not identify the object and marshal a proportional defense. It mobilizes everything. Every antibody equivalent, every surveillance cell, every chemical signal in the secondary circulatory network lights up simultaneously and converges. On a battlefield, that response profile would be called a scorched earth tactic. In a body, it is called the Kalu cascade, and the first 3 nano-medic teams to attempt insertions into Kalu patients, before the protocols existed, before anyone knew, lost their operators to that cascade within 90 seconds of entry. The operators survived. The equipment did not, and without the equipment, the operators were stranded in a collapsing microterrain with no navigation, no repair capability, and no way out except to wait for the extraction signal to cut through whatever the body was doing to their transponders. The first 2 operators made it out, the third did not. That was 9 years ago, before I joined the program. By the time I arrived, Physician Auditor Thrain had developed the cycle protocols, a staged insertion system that slowly introduced modified nanounits into a Kalu patient over successive cycles, each one slightly longer than the last, allowing the immune system to partially habituate to the presence of the equipment and reduce the cascade response. Each cycle carried its own window, calculated based on the patient's immune response data from every previous cycle. The window was the amount of time an operator could remain active inside the patient before the habituated tolerance decayed and the cascade resumed. You went in, you worked, You came out before the window closed. You ran the next cycle 48 hours later, when the immune system had reset enough to be habituated again. Cycle 1 gave you 4 minutes. Cycle 2 gave you 5.5. Cycle 3 gave you 7. By cycle 6, a healthy patient in the protocol was giving an operator 9 to 10 minutes per insertion, enough to clear a small cluster of obstructions and begin the repair work in earnest. In 6 insertions, a standard 3-person team working in rotation could usually clear 60 to 70% of a micro-obstruction field. Then they would wait for the cognitive processing cluster to recover, monitor for complications, and decide whether a cycle 7 was necessary. Ambassador Vorethdin's case required a cycle 7. The previous 6 cycles had not gone as planned. The ambassador's immune system was not standard. It habituated more slowly than the protocol predicted, which shortened each window, and it responded more aggressively to the repair filaments than to the navigation units, which meant every time an operator deployed a repair filament, the cascade response accelerated and the window narrowed further. Cycle 4 lost a team member's navigation unit to cascade failure inside the vessel. The operator came out safely, but the unit was destroyed before the planned work was complete. Cycle 5 lost 2 pieces of equipment and came out early. Cycle 6 lost a second operator to a 12-minute extension she had not been authorized to take, which left her stranded in a collapsed microterrain for 41 minutes before the extraction signal finally broke through. She came out. She was not injured. She was also not the same person she had been when she went in the specific way that people are not the same after they have spent 41 minutes alone in a dark, collapsing, hostile space with no navigation and no certainty that the signal would ever cut through. She requested reassignment 3 days later. I do not hold that against her. I mention it only because her reassignment is why Physician Auditor Thrain was standing in front of me at 0400 on a Tuesday morning, holding a tablet with the Cycle 7 brief on it, and asking me, not ordering me, asking, which was the first indication I had that this was unusual, whether I was willing to take the insertion solo. Solo, not reduced team. Solo. 1 operator, 1 navigation unit, 1 repair kit designed for a 3-person team. I asked him why not 2 operators. He said the available pool was 3 people, including me. 1 had a scheduled rotation in a different facility. 1 had been on the Cycle 6 team and had declined a Cycle 7 assignment. That left me. I asked him what the window was. He turned the tablet so I could see the screen. The number at the top of the calculation was 11 minutes and 0 seconds. Below it, in the KLU notation system that I had learned to read over the past 2 years, was the confidence rating, 83%, meaning there was a 17% chance the window was actually shorter. There was no upper confidence bound, because in Physician Auditor Thrain's 9 years of data, no window had ever been longer than calculated. The windows only ran short. 11 minutes, 83% confident it would not be less. I looked at the calculation for a long time. Thrain waited. He is good at waiting. The KLU are, as a species, better at waiting than anything I have ever encountered. They have a patience that is not the same as human patience, which is the kind that grits its teeth and endures. Theirs is structural. They simply occupy the present moment with the same thoroughness that water occupies a container, and they wait the way water waits, without effort, without cost. I told him I would take the insertion. He wrote that down too. The prep took 2 hours. This is standard. The nano-medic equipment is not large. The navigation unit, the repair kit, and the operator's own modified suit all miniaturize as part of the insertion process. And the process itself is conducted in the scanner bay under full daylight panels, which the KLU prefer because their visual processing requires bright, even light for fine detail work, and Thrain likes to watch the insertion sequence in real time. The scanner bay at that hour was empty except for the 2 of us, and the technician who ran the miniaturization array. A young Kalu named Vane, whose job it was to handle the equipment calibration and to watch the displays during the insertion. Vane had worked every cycle on Ambassador Voreth Den. He did not speak to me during the prep. He was not rude about this. The Kalu do not do rudeness in the way humans do, where the silence is designed to be felt. He was simply focused on the calibration, and when he did look up, he looked at the displays, not at me. I think he had decided, somewhere in the run of 6 failed cycles, that the correct approach to an operator about to go in was to treat them as already part of the equipment, as a component that needed calibrating rather than a person who needed reassurance. I found this at the time clarifying. During the first hour of prep, while Vane ran the calibration sequences and Thrain reviewed the scan data at his station across the bay, I read through the Cycle 7 brief for the 4th time. I had read it twice before the meeting with Thrain and once during it, following along on a separate tablet while he walked through the key points. Reading it a 4th time was not necessary. I had the critical parameters memorized, but there is a specific quality of attention that comes from reading something a 4th time that you do not get from reading it twice. The first reading builds the picture. The second reading checks it. The third reading starts to find the gaps. The 4th reading looks at the gaps directly. The gap I had been looking at since the second reading was the repair kit specifications. The kit was designed for a 3-person team. The design assumption was 2 operators running repair units in parallel, while the third handled navigation and monitoring. The 12 application units in the kit were documented as a 6+6 allocation, 6 for each repair operator, running in parallel but monitored separately, each operator tracking their own 6. The solo deployment protocol, which existed in the kit's documentation because the kit's designers had been thorough enough to consider failure modes, assumed that a solo operator would run 6 units maximum, leaving 6 in reserve for a second deployment phase or an emergency reserve. 6 units, the documentation said, do not exceed 6 solo. I read that line in the 4th pass and thought about the obstruction field in the deep medial cluster and thought about 11 minutes and did the arithmetic again and came out with the same answer I had come out with the first 3 times. 6 units in 11 minutes would not clear the field. The mathematics of the obstruction density and the application rate of 6 units, run for the time I would have available for actual repair work after navigation and setup, and with room left for extraction, produced a clearance percentage that was not meaningfully better than what the Cycle 6 team had achieved before they came out short. I was not going in to not be meaningfully better than Cycle 6. There was no point in that. The window would be shorter on every subsequent cycle if there was a next cycle, and there was no next cycle that Thrain had told me to count on. I made a decision during the 4th pass of the brief that I did not share with Thrain and did not note in my pre-insertion checklist. I closed the brief and set the tablet down and went back to watching Vane calibrate the equipment. Thrain had me wear the wrist display during prep. This was his addition to the protocol, something he had introduced after the Cycle 6 incident, when the operator had not known how close the window was because her in-suit display had been knocked offline in the cascade. The wrist display was simple, a small unit strapped to my left forearm, synchronized to the window calculation, counting down from the moment of entry confirmation. At the moment I went in, it would read 11 minutes. It would count down at 1-second intervals, green until 4 minutes remained, then yellow until 1 minute remained, then red. When it reached 0, the window was closed. The display did not have a function beyond that. It did not signal anything. It did not trigger an extraction. It did not alert Thrain. It was simply a number on my wrist, and whatever I did about that number was my own business. I strapped it on. Thrain checked the fit. It had to sit flush against the suit at the wrist seal, so the miniaturization process included it, and then he checked it again. Then he looked at me for a long time without writing anything down. He said, No human has completed a cycle 7 insertion solo. I said, that's because there's never been a cycle 7 before. He said, that is technically correct. I said, then let's not make too much of it. He wrote that down. The second hour of prep was the equipment integration phase, where the navigation unit and the repair kit are coupled to the operator's suit systems, and the whole assembly runs a synchronization test under the miniaturization array's pre-scan field. This is the hour when most operators go quiet, not because they are told to, but because the physical reality of what is about to happen has a way of making words feel like the wrong tool for the moment. You are going to go inside a living body. You are going to navigate through it using instruments calibrated to tolerances finer than anything in ordinary surgery, in conditions that the body itself will be working to prevent, with a time limit that does not negotiate. There is nothing to say about that. You can describe it or you cannot describe it, and describing it does not change anything about it. I spent the second hour reading the scan maps of Ambassador Vorethdin's secondary circulatory network for the 6th time. I had been given access to all 6 cycles of scan data, and the deep medial cluster was the region I had mapped most carefully. I knew the geometry of the vessel branches. I knew the locations of every documented obstruction point. I knew the 3 places where previous teams had encountered unexpected cascade acceleration. I knew, from the Cycle 6 team's report, that the right lateral branch of the deep medial approach ran narrower than the map showed by approximately 12%, because the cascade response had caused some vessel wall thickening that the scan resolution had not fully captured. I knew all of this. I had known it since the second reading of the brief. By the 6th study of the maps, I was not learning new information. I was building the route into a kind of physical memory, the way you can learn a floor plan thoroughly enough that you can walk it in the dark. The map in my hands and the path through the body all becoming one continuous thing. Vane finished the calibration at 6:43. He ran the synchronization test, read the results, and then turned to Thrain and said something in rapid Kalu that I did not fully catch. My comprehension is conversational but not technical, and Kalu technical vocabulary at speed is a different language than Kalu conversation. Thrain listened, looked at the display Vane was indicating, and made an adjustment to the kit's base configuration settings. Then he turned to me and said, "The kit is calibrated for single-operator use." I said, "I saw him make that change." Thrain said, "It reduces the deployment range of the repair units by 8% in exchange for improved haptic feedback resolution at the control surface. For a solo operator managing more units than standard, the feedback precision is more valuable than the range." I looked at him for a moment. He looked back at me with the structural patience. I said, "You adjusted the calibration for 12 simultaneous units." He said, "I adjusted the calibration for the operational conditions this insertion presents." He wrote something in his tablet. He did not turn it toward me. The miniaturization array takes 90 seconds once it begins. The sensation is not painful and it is not pleasant. It is the specific sensation of every proportion you have ever understood about your body becoming wrong simultaneously, of the world scaling up around you at a rate your inner ear interprets as a fall that never resolves. I have done 14 insertions over 2 years. It is not a sensation that becomes familiar in a comfortable way. It becomes familiar the way stepping off a boat onto a dock becomes familiar. You know intellectually that the ground is solid, but your body has not forgotten the motion of the water. I looked at the scanner bay ceiling as the array ran. The daylight panels were fully lit, broad, even, the Kalu's preferred working light, warmer than human standard, flooding the room without shadow. Vane was at his displays, his back to me, his attention entirely on the readouts that tracked the miniaturization progress. Thrain was standing at the edge of the recovery space, tablet in hand, not looking at the readouts but at me, with the expression he always has during the array run, not concerned, not clinical, but present in the specific way he is present when he has done everything he can do, and is now simply watching whether the thing he prepared for comes through or does not. I have never asked him what he thinks about during those 90 seconds. I do not think he would give me a useful answer. I think he thinks about the data. I think the data, for him, is not a cold thing but a live one, every number from every cycle, held in a structure of understanding so complete that watching a new insertion begin is, for him, a kind of dialogue with everything that has come before it. He remembers the operator 9 years ago who did not come out for 41 minutes. He remembers the 3 who were lost before the cycle protocols existed. He carries all of it. He carries it the way the protocols carry it, not as weight but as calibration. The array finished at 7:12. The room was the same room and I was not. Entry point for a KLU vascular insertion is always the same. The secondary circulatory junction behind the left lateral processing lobe, which in human anatomical terms is approximately equivalent to the back of the neck. The entry is thermal. The miniaturized operator enters through a calibrated thermal channel that the patient's immune system does not register as foreign penetration because its signature matches the body's own chemical baseline. This is Thrain's most elegant piece of engineering, and he knows it. The thermal channel lasts exactly 40 seconds. 40 seconds to navigate from the entry point to the first operational position inside the vessel network. My wrist display started counting the moment I cleared the entry point. 11 minutes, green. I will try to describe what it looks like inside a KLU secondary circulatory vessel, because I think the description matters for understanding what the 11 minutes actually means in physical terms. The vessels are not, as I initially imagined, when I was studying the anatomy before my first insertion, like pipes. They are not cylindrical, not smooth, not uniform in diameter. They are organic structures that the KLU body builds and rebuilds constantly, and at the nanoscale they look the way a canyon looks from the floor. Vast curved walls of organic material above you, narrowing and widening unpredictably, branching at angles that the navigation unit's mapping function processes faster than I can consciously track. The secondary circulatory fluid is not blood in any sense I had a word for before I did this work. It is dense, denser than water, with a slight luminescence that comes from the bioluminescent markers the KLU body uses for internal chemical signaling. At the scales I work at, the fluid is not invisible. It has texture. It catches the navigation unit's light and refracts it in ways that make the interior of the vessel look, at certain angles and in certain states, like the inside of something alive and aware. Which it is, of course. The body is aware of everything inside it. The entire immune response architecture is an awareness system. You are inside something that knows you are there and is deciding moment by moment whether you are acceptable. The first time I did an insertion, cycle 2 into a KLU administrative official with a simple peripheral obstruction, 5.5 minutes, out with 2 minutes to spare. The textbook easy case that new operators run before they see anything complicated. I was struck by the specific quality of the light. Inside, the bioluminescent markers gave the whole environment a steady, soft glow that was different from any light I had worked in on the surface. Not warm, not cold. Present. Continuous. Like the light inside a room where someone has just put down their tools and stepped out and the room is still carrying the warmth of them. I did not expect that. None of the training described it. You cannot describe it in advance because until you are inside it, it does not have a referent in your experience. Afterward, it is the first thing you think of when you think about the work, the light, and what it means to be inside a body that is trying to decide what you are. In cycle 7, the answer was going to change to no in 11 minutes. 10 minutes 40 seconds, green. The obstruction field for this insertion was in the deep medial cluster, a region Thrain's maps identified as the highest density concentration of micro-obstructions remaining after 6 cycles of partial clearance. The previous teams had worked the periphery, clearing the easier, more accessible obstructions first, because the deep medial cluster was both the most critical region and the most difficult to reach. Reaching it in a team configuration had required one operator running navigation, while two others handled repair. With one operator, I would be doing all three functions with a kit designed for 3 pairs of hands, in a region that the previous team had flagged as having the fastest cascade acceleration they had measured across all 6 cycles. The navigation unit and I moved fast. Fast is relative at the nanoscale. What I mean is that I was not being careful with my route in the way a cycle 4 or 5 operator would be, picking the lowest resistance path to minimize immune contact. I was moving directly. Every degree of deviation from the direct route to the deep medial cluster was 11 seconds I would not have for the repair work, and I did not have 11 seconds to spare. I had 11 minutes total for navigation, setup, repair, and extraction, and I had run the numbers enough times in the 2 hours of prep that I knew exactly how much each of those phases needed to cost me. Navigation, 3 minutes maximum. Setup, 90 seconds. Repair, 5 minutes minimum to clear the critical obstructions. Extraction, 60 seconds to reach the secondary exit point before the window closed. 3 minutes plus 90 seconds plus 5 minutes plus 60 seconds is 11 minutes and 30 seconds. 30 seconds over. I had run this calculation 17 times during prep, and it came out the same way every time. There was no version of this insertion where all 4 phases fit inside 11 minutes without compressing one of them. I had decided, during the 2nd hour of prep, that I would compress navigation. I would take the direct route regardless of immune contact, accept the cascade acceleration that came with it, and bank the saved time against the repair phase. It would shorten my effective window. The cascade, once accelerated, does not slow back down, but it would give me more hands-on time with the obstructions, which was the only variable I could actually control. 10 minutes 2 seconds, green. The deep medial cluster was worse than Thrane's maps had suggested. This is not a criticism of Thrane's maps, which were as precise as 6 cycles of scan data could make them. It is simply a statement about the nature of a body that has been failing for 6 days. The obstruction field had evolved. The micro-obstructions that the maps showed as discrete, individual blockages had, in the 6 days since the last scan, begun to aggregate, to cluster and link, forming chains of obstruction material that the repair kit had not been designed to address as chains. The kit could dissolve individual obstructions. It could not, in a single application, dissolve a chain without addressing each link sequentially. I stood at the edge of the deep medial cluster with 8 minutes and 41 seconds remaining on my wrist display and looked at what was in front of me, and I made a decision that no protocol covered. I am not a person who ignores protocols. I want to be clear about that. I have been in this program for 2 years, and in that time I have never exceeded a window, never modified my kit without authorization, never deviated from a route without flagging the deviation to the monitoring team. I follow protocols the way you follow a navigation instrument in poor conditions, not because you cannot see where you are going, but because the instrument has been calibrated against conditions you cannot fully perceive, and the people who calibrated it knew more about those conditions than you can know in the moment. What I mean is that I trust protocols. What I also mean is that I understand what they are. They are the accumulated decisions of people who were not in the specific situation I was in, made before the situation existed. And in the specific situation I was in, with 8 minutes and 41 seconds remaining and a chain-aggregated obstruction field that no protocol had anticipated, the protocol said, "Report the deviation, await guidance, proceed only with authorization." Authorization, from the scanner bay where Thrane and Vane were watching my transponder signal, would take a minimum of 3 minutes to receive and process. 3 minutes I did not have. I began working. The repair kit carries 12 application units. In a standard 3-person operation, 4 units are assigned to each operator. Working solo, I had all 12, and I used them the way I had never used them before, not sequentially, not by protocol order, but simultaneously, in a parallel deployment that the kit's design had never intended, and that I had worked out in theory during the second prep hour when I was still pretending to myself that the window calculation might somehow come out differently. 8 minutes 20 seconds, green. You cannot, at the nanoscale, deploy 12 repair units simultaneously and also monitor all of them. The monitoring is the cognitive load, and the cognitive load for 12 simultaneous units is above what a single operator can track with full attention. I know this. Thrain knows this. I had read his technical notes on multi-unit deployment limits in the program's research archive, and his upper bound for a solo operator was 6 units before attention, fragmentation began to degrade accuracy. What his notes did not account for was what happens to attention when the alternative to fragmentation is failure. I am not claiming I became superhuman. I am not claiming the stress sharpened me into something I was not. What I am claiming is that there are states of focus that human beings can achieve under specific conditions, conditions of narrow time, high stakes, and no backup, that do not normally exist in training or in normal operational parameters. Athletes know this. Surgeons know this. People who have been in situations where the option of dividing their attention was not available know this. You do not become more capable. You become more present. The fragmentation that Thrain's notes predicted assumes a mind with room to fragment. A mind with no room does not fragment. It simply does what is in front of it. I watched 12 units. I tracked their progress through the obstruction chain by the haptic feedback in the kit's control surface, which I held in both hands with the navigation unit clamped to my forearm, and the wrist display visible at the edge of my peripheral vision whenever I looked left. I did not look left often. I looked left enough. 7 minutes 4 seconds, green. The cascade acceleration I had bought with the direct route came in at 7 minutes and 2 seconds, earlier than I had projected, which told me that the deep medial cluster had a higher immune contact density than the scan data showed. The fluid around me changed. I could feel it before I could see it, a shift in resistance, a thickening that the suit registered as an increase in viscosity, meaning the immune system's first response chemicals were flooding the local area. The bioluminescent markers in the fluid changed color. In a healthy area of the vessel, they were a soft, cool blue-green. In the area now surrounding me, they were shifting toward a deep amber. Thrain's protocols had a name for the amber state, convergence onset. It meant the cascade was coming, and it was not going to wait for the window to close. It was going to close the window itself. I worked faster. There is a particular kind of calm that I do not have a good word for in any language I know. It is not serenity, which implies an absence of pressure. It is not concentration, which implies a narrowing of awareness. It is something more like the feeling of a structure that has been loaded to its design limit and is holding every component at full tension, nothing slack, nothing failing, the whole thing simply bearing what it was built to bear. I have felt it in training, briefly, in controlled scenarios designed to simulate high-load conditions. I have felt it twice in actual insertions, in moments where the situation outpaced the protocol, and I was left with nothing but the situation and my own capability. I felt it in the deep medial cluster of Ambassador Vorethen's secondary circulatory system, standing inside the failing body of an alien diplomat I had never met, and was trying to save using equipment designed for 3 people, and a window that was going to close whether I was finished or not. 6 minutes 11 seconds, green. The obstruction chain was not dissolving uniformly. The repair units, I was running 12, but the chain had 14 linked points and the end points were the densest, were clearing the middle sections faster than the anchors. This is a known behavior in chain-aggregated obstructions. The anchor points bind more tightly because they form first and have more contact surface with the vessel wall. Clearing them requires more dissolved application, more time, more unit hours of work than the middle links. I had assigned 3 units to each anchor and 6 to the middle, and the middle was clearing on schedule while the anchors were not. 5 minutes 30 seconds, green. I pulled 2 units from the middle. The middle was going to finish early, I could see it in the haptic feedback, and redirected them to the left anchor, which was running behind. This is not a protocol action. The kit's deployment logic does not support mid-operation unit reallocation. The firmware assumes each unit's assignment is fixed at deployment. I did it manually, through the Control Surfaces Maintenance Interface, which is a function designed for equipment diagnostics and not for live operational use, and it took 48 seconds that I did not have. 4 minutes 53 seconds, yellow. Yellow, I looked left. The number was in yellow, which my peripheral vision had been waiting for without my conscious mind quite registering that it was waiting, and now it was there, and it was real, and I still had 5 anchor points uncleared on the right side of the chain. I made another decision that no protocol covered. The obstruction chain had formed in a specific geometry, 14 points linking 2 vessel walls in a configuration that partially occluded the flow channel. A complete clearance meant dissolving all 14 points and restoring the channel to full patency. A partial clearance, say, 10 or 11 points, leaving only the end anchors, would reduce the occlusion significantly without restoring it completely. Whether a partial clearance was clinically sufficient to save the ambassador's cognitive function was a question I did not have the data to answer. That was Thrain's data. It lived in the scanner bay, in Thrain's tablet, in the years of correlation between obstruction severity and functional outcome that I had read in the program's research archive, and that I absolutely could not replicate in a vessel by the light of amber bioluminescent markers. What I had was this: the ambassador had been failing for 6 days, and his cognition was degrading toward a point that Thrain had described, in the Cycle 7 brief, as terminal. A partial clearance was not the goal. A partial clearance had been achieved in Cycles 4, 5, and 6, and the ambassador had continued to fail. The Cycle 7 insertion existed specifically because the partial clearances had not been enough. If I came out with 5 anchor points remaining, I was not certain I was coming out with an alive ambassador. I was certain I was coming out with a shorter window than 11 minutes the next time, and Thrain had not said there would be a next time. He had said, in the Cycle 7 brief, that the window calculations beyond Cycle 7 projected below 4 minutes, which was below the operational minimum for any meaningful repair work. There was no Cycle 8. Thrain had simply not said so directly. He had not needed to. I kept all 12 units running. I did not come out early. I did not bank the remaining time. I used it. 3 minutes 40 seconds, yellow. 3 minutes 2 seconds, yellow. The right anchor was clearing. Slower than the left, slower than I needed it to be, but clearing. The haptic feedback had a specific signature for obstruction dissolution. A slight softening in the resistance profile, like the difference between pressing a thumb into clay versus pressing it into wet sand. A distinction fine enough that it took most operators 3 or 4 insertions to start perceiving it reliably. I had perceived it since my 5th insertion, and now I tracked it across 12 simultaneous haptic channels, the way you learn to hear all the instruments in a piece of music at once without losing any single one. 2 minutes 14 seconds, yellow. 2 minutes, 80% of the obstruction chain cleared, the middle entirely dissolved, the left anchor gone, the right anchor at I did not have a precise measurement. I had the haptic feedback and my own judgment which told me, most of the right anchor. 1 minute 48 seconds, yellow. I needed to begin moving toward the secondary exit point. The secondary exit point was 60 seconds of navigation from my current position under normal conditions. Under the present conditions, the cascade in convergence onset, the fluid resistance elevated, the navigation route partially altered by the dissolution work I had been doing. It was going to be more than 60 seconds. It was going to be whatever I could make it, moving as fast as the navigation unit could take me through a hostile and narrowing microterrain. 1 minute 22 seconds, yellow. I pulled the repair units. All 12 retracted back to the kit secured, the navigation unit brought back online and oriented toward the secondary exit. The 12-unit retraction took 18 seconds. 18 seconds I had known, from the moment I deployed them in parallel, that I would not have at the end. 1 minute 4 seconds, yellow. I moved. I will not describe the navigation in detail because the detail is not what matters. What matters is that I moved through a body that was closing around me, not with malice, because a body is not malicious, because the immune system is not capable of malice. It is only capable of indiscriminate response. An indiscriminate response is in some ways worse than malice because malice at least implies a mind that can be reasoned with. The cascade was not reasoning, it was mobilizing. The amber markers were everywhere now. The vessel walls were changing texture in ways that the navigation unit flagged as structural instability warnings. The cascade was not only flooding the fluid with response chemicals, it was beginning to alter the vessel wall structure itself. The body's most extreme immune response, the kind that in a standard KLU patient would have happened 90 seconds after entry, and that the cycle protocol had bought me 11 minutes of delay on. The delay was over. 41 seconds, red. Red on the wrist display, and I looked at it directly for the first time since I had last checked it at 2 minutes 14 seconds, and it was red, which meant less than 60 seconds, which meant I should have begun the extraction navigation 41 seconds ago. I was not where I needed to be. I was close. Close enough to know that 60 seconds from this position under normal conditions would have got me to the exit point with time to spare. Under these conditions, with the vessel walls beginning to contract, and the fluid resistance spiking, and the navigation unit throwing warning signals in the lower left of my visual field, close enough was not a measurement I could trust. 33 seconds, red. I will say this about the final 33 seconds. I have thought about them more than about any other 33 seconds of my life, and I have not arrived at anything useful to say. I moved. The navigation unit moved with me. The body tried to close around me, and I moved through the closing. There was a moment, I believe it was around the 15-second mark, though my sense of time at that point was not reliable, where the secondary exit channel was visible in the navigation unit's display, and was not wide enough for me to fit through because the cascade had begun contracting it, and I used the last 2 dissolve applications in the kit's residual reserve. 2 applications I had not known the kit had. 2 applications that are part of a safety reserve I had apparently forgotten about in prep, or more likely had not forgotten, but had simply not included in my calculations because I was not supposed to be using the safety reserve on a structural problem. The safety reserve is for operator emergency, not for venue clearance, to widen the channel by exactly the amount I needed. Exactly, not more. I do not know how I calibrated that. I think I was simply, at that point, beyond careful and into something else. Beyond careful and into exact. 0 red. I went through the channel. The extraction process is thermal, like the entry. The channel closes behind you as you pass through it. The body seals the exit point as part of the immune response, which is why you cannot go back in once the window has closed, why there is no option of a partial exit and return to finish the work. You go through or you do not go through, and once you are through, the window is closed and the body is locked, and whatever state you have left the repair work in is the state it will remain in. I went through at 0. I do not know if I went through at 0.2 or 0.17. I know I went through at 0 because the display read 0 when I checked it in the extraction chamber, lying on the thermal recovery surface while the miniaturization process reversed and the world contracted back to its normal proportions around me. Green to yellow to red to 0. The whole cycle spent. It took 18 minutes for the reversal to complete. During those 18 minutes, I did not think about the obstruction chain or the right anchor or the 5 points I had not been certain about when I pulled the units. I thought about the fact that I was cold. The recovery surface is heated, but after 11 minutes in a KLU secondary circulatory environment, the body's thermoregulation is disoriented, and you are cold in a way that the heated surface addresses only gradually, and the coldness is intensely real in a way that I found at the time to be the most welcome thing I had ever felt. Cold and real and here and done. Physician Auditor Thrain was waiting at the edge of the recovery space when the chamber opened. He was holding his tablet. Vane was at the displays behind him, and there were 2 other KLU in the room who had not been there when I went in medical staff. I assumed, though in the fog of the reversal I did not look at them closely enough to be certain. The scanner bay was bright with the full daylight panels, the light that the KLU use for fine detail work, the same light the room had been in when I strapped on the wrist display, and Thrain told me no human had completed a cycle 7 insertion solo. He did not say anything when the chamber opened. He looked at me and then he looked at the wrist display, which was still on my left forearm, still reading 0 in red. I sat on the extraction table, and I looked at the display on my wrist to make sure it still read 0. Then I looked at it again because I had decided during the reversal that I was going to keep looking at it until I had fully understood that it was real, that the number on it was the number that meant I had spent the entire window, every second of it, and come out the other side. 0. Not a number with any future. A complete number. A finished thing. Thrain put his tablet on the extraction table beside me and turned it so I could see the screen. The screen showed the ambassador's current scan data, updated live from the biomonitors that had been tracking him throughout the insertion. I am not a diagnostician. Reading KLU scan data is not my primary training, but I have spent 2 years learning to understand the displays well enough to know what I am looking at. And what I was looking at was a blood flow pattern in the secondary circulatory network that had, in the 40 minutes since my extraction, shifted toward normal. Not fully normal, but toward it. The deep medial cluster, which had been a dense mass of obstruction markers on every previous scan, was largely clear. There was a small residual cluster at the right anchor position, the 5 points I had not been certain about, but the flow channel was open. The blood flow pattern was moving through it. I said, "Is that enough?" Thrain looked at the scan for a moment. He said, "The cognitive monitoring shows stable function. We will know more in 6 hours." I said, "But is that enough?" He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, "The channel is open. That is what we needed." I looked back at my wrist display. 0. I checked it twice more in the next 5 minutes while Thrain ran through the debrief questions, standard questions, the same ones after every cycle, questions about what I had observed inside and what equipment I had used, and whether I had deviated from the protocol. I answered all of them honestly, including the parts about the parallel unit deployment and the mid-operation reallocation, and the safety reserve applications I had not been authorized to use. He wrote all of it down. He asked me, about 30 minutes into the debrief, why I had not initiated a partial extraction when the display went yellow. I said, because partial wasn't going to be enough. He said, "You could not have known that. You did not have the diagnostic data." I said, "I had your brief. You wrote that below 4 minutes the operational minimum for meaningful repair work is not achievable. You did not say there would be a cycle 8. I read what you didn't say." He looked at me. He wrote something down on the tablet. He turned it so I could not see what he had written, which was unusual. He had been turning the tablet toward me for the entire debrief. Whatever he wrote in that moment, he kept for himself. Ambassador Vorethdin was conscious and speaking by the following morning. His cognitive function, according to the 6-hour assessment that Thrain ran while I was sleeping, was at 81% of baseline, significantly degraded from pre-illness levels, the diagnostician said, but within the range of functional recovery. Over the next several days, as the obstruction field continued to dissolve on its own, the repair work, once the channel was open, allowed the body's own clearing mechanisms to take over. That number would improve further. Thrain told me this in a follow-up meeting that he had requested formally, which I had not expected. He showed me the updated scans. He explained the recovery trajectory. He used the phrase meaningful recovery, which in KLU medical terminology has a specific clinical weight that I knew enough to appreciate. Then he put the tablet down and sat across from me and said, "I want to understand what you did with 12 simultaneous units." I said I tracked them. He said, "The documented cognitive load limit for a solo operator in multi-unit deployment is 6. You ran 12. I said I know. He said, "I want to understand how." I thought about this for a moment. I thought about the description of the structure bearing its load. I thought about the amber markers and the closing vessel walls, and the wrist display going from green to yellow to red to 0 in the time it took me to do a thing that needed doing. I thought about the cold on the recovery surface and how real it had been and how I had been glad of it. I said, "I don't think I can explain it in a way that translates into a training parameter. It wasn't a technique. It was just there wasn't room for it to fail, so it didn't." He looked at me for a long time with the patience that is structural rather than effortful. Then he said, "I am going to recommend revising the solo deployment protocols based on this insertion." I said, "Based on one case." He said, "Based on the case for which I have the data. It is how science works." I said, "Fair enough." He picked up his tablet and wrote something, and this time he did not turn it away. He turned it toward me. On the screen, in KLU notation, he had written a word that I had learned in my first month in the program. A word from their physiological documentation that appeared in case files when an outcome exceeded the projected parameters by a margin significant enough to require formal notation. The word was, roughly translated, unclassified, meaning a result for which the existing classification system has no adequate category. He said, "I have used that notation 4 times in 9 years. 3 of them were adverse events. This is the first time I have used it for a successful outcome." I sat with that for a moment. The KLU formal notation system is not casual. It exists because the medical authority believes that imprecise language produces imprecise thinking, and imprecise thinking in their field produces dead patients. When Thrain writes a word in that system, it is not a word he has chosen loosely. It is the word he believes is correct. Unclassified in his notation does not mean unknown. It means that the category system is inadequate to the event, that the event has revealed a gap in the categories, that the categories will now need to be revised. He was revising the categories because of a number on a wrist display. I looked at the notation on his tablet. Then I looked at the wrist display on my forearm, which I was still wearing because I had not taken it off and no one had asked me to. 0, still 0. It would read 0 until someone reset it. I had not reset it. I asked him if I could keep the display. He looked at the display on my wrist for a long moment. Then he said, "It is program equipment." I said, "I know." He said, "I will note that it is being retained for post-insertion documentation purposes." He wrote that down. I still wear it sometimes. Not on operations. On operations I wear the current tissue display, the newer model they introduced 6 months after the Vorethdin insertion, which has a slightly different form factor and a slightly brighter screen. I wear the old one on days when I need to remember what it looks like when a number is complete, when 0 means finished and not empty. When you have looked at a window closing and decided, before it closed, what you were going to do with the time. Thrain revised the solo deployment protocol 4 months after the insertion. The new version carries a maximum of 10 simultaneous units for a solo operator under specific cascade onset conditions, not 12, which he considers the outer edge of what the data supports, and not 6, which the previous protocol had set as the limit based on the wrong assumption about where the limit actually was. 10. He derived the number from the insertion data, from my transponder record and the kit's internal logging, and the haptic feedback telemetry that Vane had been capturing from the external display throughout the operation. He showed me the derivation. I told him it seemed conservative. He told me that conservative is what evidence-based revision looks like when you only have one case. I told him that was fair. The protocol revision carries a notation in its header, standard KLU practice for any revision that originates from a specific clinical event. The notation cites the VORETHDEN case file. It cites the window. It cites the display reading at the moment of extraction, 0. Every operator who reads the new protocol will read that number. I do not know whether that will mean anything to them. It means something to me. It means that the protocol now knows something it did not know before, and it knows it because someone spent a window completely, down to the last second, and the last second was enough. 11 minutes. We had used 9 when the yellow came. We used all 11. We used the 0. Ambassador VORETHDEN sent a formal communication to the program 3 weeks after his discharge from the medical facility. I was told about it by Thrain, who read the relevant section to me in the same measured way he does everything. The communication was a standard diplomatic acknowledgement of care received, written in the formal KLU register that their diplomatic corps uses for official gratitude, which is elaborate and precise in ways that do not translate cleanly into the kind of language I would use to say the same things. What it said, in the formal register, was that the ambassador had been informed of the nature of the final insertion and of the solo operator who had conducted it, and that he wished to formally note that the outcome had exceeded the projected parameters of the clinical protocol, and that he had asked his staff to research the name of the operator so that he might include it in his formal record of the event. My name is in an alien diplomat's formal record of the event. I do not know what that means practically. I do not know what it will do for my career or my program standing or my insertion rotation schedule. I know that Thrain noted it in my file and that the notation was the same word he had used on his tablet when he turned the screen toward me. Unclassified. I know that the wrist display still reads 0. Some numbers are not a beginning or an end. They are a line you drew under something that needed finishing. You drew it and the thing is finished and the number stays where you left it. 0. That is what I check for. That is what I have been checking for since the morning I came out of the extraction chamber and sat on the table in the bright scanner bay and looked at my left wrist and found that the number I had gone in with was spent, completely and without remainder, and that on the other side of the spending, a window that had been closing had closed, and something that had been failing was not failing anymore. 0 still 0, good.